Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Health Foundation webinar on the upcoming public inquiry into the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic chaired by Baroness Hallett. Baroness Hallett and her team, as you know, have consulted on the terms of reference and made recommendations to government, which should be finalised later this year. And her letter is in the PM's large in tray at the moment, awaiting a response. As you also know, the primary purpose of the inquiry will be to identify the lessons learned from the way the pandemic was managed and how to do better in future. So in this webinar, what we want to explore is what are the key questions for the inquiry to address? And most crucially, how, given the shape of different types of inquiries, how this one can be the most impactful given our experience of previous ones. So my name is Jennifer Dixon. I'm really pleased to be your chair for this interesting discussion today. And I'm really pleased to say we're joined by really expert guests, three of them, who will be helping us with our inquiries, so to speak. So the first is I'd like to introduce Dame Una O'Brien, who many of you will know. She's currently in a variety of non-executive and mentor roles, but she was the permanent secretary at the Department of Health and Social Care between 2010 and 2016. And Una is very unusual in having both run a public inquiry, that's the Kennedy inquiry on pediatric cardiac surgery back in 98 to 2001. And she's also served on the panel of another inquiry later on in her career, which was something not on health. It was the Renewable Heat Incentive Inquiry in Northern Ireland, which finished in 2020. Also, just to say, while Una was at the Department of Health and Social Care, she was also involved in the setting up of several inquiries, including the monumental Mid-Staffs inquiry that many of you will know about. So welcome, Una. Very glad to have you here. Also very pleased to welcome Emma Norris, who is the Director of Research for the Institute for Government. At IFG, Emma has led research on a number of very important policies, health and otherwise, and she is the IFG's resident expert on public inquiries, leading their work on the COVID inquiry. So we're really thrilled to have you, Emma, here today. And last but not least, our very own Tim Gardner, who is a senior policy specialist here at the Health Foundation. And I'm pleased to say he's been with us since 2014, really doing superb work on a variety of issues, spare his blushes. And before that, he was at the Department of Health and Social Care for over a decade. And while he was there, he worked on the government's response to the Francis inquiry, amongst other things. So really, we have three really very experienced speakers for you here today. So what we have is we have just over an hour for this discussion. We're going to finish by 11:15. And what we're going to do is have Tim first set the scene for us with a few slides just to try to just get us used to this territory and pose a few questions. And then I'll ask Una and Emma both to respond to what has been said and anything else that they feel is important at this initial stage. And then we'll have a discussion drawing on your questions. So please feel free to ask them. So what you need to do, as I think all of you who are Zoomers know, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Please ask away, have a lot more questions the better. Remember, we're focusing on the process of the inquiry and the questions as opposed to what went wrong itself. So let's try and focus on those things, but really welcome your questions. And you can upvote someone else's questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and we'll try and answer most of the most popular questions. So we'll look forward to that. And thank you for everyone who's already submitted a question, much, much appreciated. So last, a bit of housekeeping from me. This event is being recorded as usual, and a video is going to be on our website within 24 hours. So if you would like to see it again, please do, and also tell your friends. And a subtitle version will follow afterwards. And lastly, for anyone wishing to tweet today, the hashtag is #COVIDinquiry, and hopefully you can tweet away and help people access this interesting resource that will be the discussion. So that's probably enough for me to kick off, and I'm now going to turn to my colleague Tim, who, as I said, is going to set the scene for us and kick us off. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I think there should be some slides appearing in just a moment. Here they go. So just before we start getting into some of the big questions that we want to discuss on the webinar, I'm just going to recap what we can expect from a public inquiry and some of the developments with the UK COVID-19 inquiry so far. Essentially, a public inquiry is an independent investigation, usually into a major accident, a disaster, or when government or a public body is involved in something that's gone horribly wrong. Fundamentally, the main purpose of a public inquiry is to establish the facts and learn lessons so that mistakes aren't repeated in future. There may also be a range of other purposes or objectives set for an inquiry, such as determining accountability and understanding who bears responsibility for the events being investigated. There may be an objective to help try to bring about reconciliation and a sense of catharsis for some of the people who have been most directly affected by the matters being investigated. And there may also be a hope to help restore public confidence that the events won't happen again in a similar form. Inquiries can also serve political purposes, such as creating a case for fundamental change, or to show that something is being done. Have the next slide, please. So the UK COVID-19 inquiry is going to be a statutory public inquiry, meaning it will be held under the Inquiries Act 2005. This really matters because there's no other type of investigation or inquiry that will have more power or greater independence from government. Once formally established, the chair of the inquiry will have statutory powers to compel evidence to be disclosed, to subpoena witnesses to give evidence, and to hear that testimony in public and under oath. So the witnesses to a public inquiry often have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The inquiry will also be able to hear evidence in private, but there is a general and rather strong presumption in favour of openness and transparency. And when the inquiry reports its findings to ministers, as it must do, those findings must be published. But it's worth noting that an inquiry can't rule on criminal or civil liability, although it may lead to other proceedings, and the evidence it uncovers could be used in other investigations. Can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of what we know about the UK COVID-19 inquiry so far, it's been nearly 2 years since the Prime Minister committed to an independent inquiry in response to a question at PMQs. About a year ago, the plan for a full statutory public inquiry was announced, with an expectation that it would start work in spring 2022. Given the recent weather, it's now clearly summer. The inquiry will be UK-wide. Baroness Hallett was appointed as chair about 6 months ago. There will have been a lot happening, especially behind the scenes, but the inquiry is yet to be formally established by the UK government, let alone to start hearing evidence. What we have seen, the major development so far has been the consultation on the draft terms of reference. And this is the key document for any inquiry. It sets out the parameters of the inquiry, the main questions it must look at, and the matters that should be covered by its recommendations. That draft was published back in March this year. Next slide, please. So that draft terms of reference that was published for consultation was really quite expansive. It covered the impact of COVID on bereaved families, on people working in health and social care, on other key workers, and also those who suffered hardship or loss due to the pandemic. It will see the inquiry tasked with looking at the public health response to COVID-19, including decisions made by the UK government, by the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and by local authorities across the UK as well. It will look at the consequences of those decisions for society at large, with particular focus on, for example, the impact on education, the economy, the justice system, housing and homelessness, prisons and places of detention, travel, immigration, and the asylum system. It will examine the health and social care response to COVID, including preparedness for a pandemic, the management of the outbreak in hospitals and care homes, the provision and distribution of key supplies like PPE, the consequences of the pandemic for people with health and social care needs unrelated to COVID, and the provision for those experiencing long COVID. The inquiry will also be tasked with looking at the economic response. So that covers support for businesses and jobs, the extra funding for public services, changes to benefits and sick pay, and support for vulnerable people. Within all of this, it will look at the inequalities that were evident in the state's response to COVID and the wider impact of the pandemic, with reference to some of the protected characteristics in law. And then across all of this, it will look at lessons to be learned to inform UK's preparations for future pandemics and other civil emergencies. As inquiry chair, Baroness Hallett was tasked with undertaking a 4-week consultation on that draft and for making recommendations for a final terms of reference back to the government. The consultation isn't a legal requirement, although it does follow some recent precedents set by, for example, the infected blood and Grenfell Tower inquiries. Important to note, though, that the final decision on exactly what's in the terms of reference will rest with the Prime Minister rather than the inquiry. Next slide, please. So the inquiry received over 20,000 responses to its consultation. Baroness Hallett responded to the Prime Minister last month with a number of recommendations for broadening some existing aspects of the terms of reference and adding some new points in to make those explicit. So those included broadening the point on the health and social care sector response to include social care provision outside of care homes and including unpaid care, to look at the role of NHS 111, the ambulance service and general practice, as well as the impact of therapeutics and vaccines. The existing point on the public health response was broadened to look at how data, research and expert evidence was used to inform government decisions and how those decisions were made, communicated, recorded and implemented. A key recommendation to the Prime Minister was to allow the inquiry to take a broader approach to examining inequalities, letting the inquiry look at any disparity or inequality, including but not limited to the protected characteristics. And then finally, there were 2 new points that weren't explicitly included before. So the first being on the impact of the pandemic on children and young people, including early years, child protection, children in care, secure children's homes, mental health and well-being, and the impact on babies and maternity services. And then secondly, looking at the impact of the pandemic on mental health and well-being, particularly how this was taken into account in decisions, the growth in mental health problems during the pandemic, and the provision for mental health service in plans for the recovery from the pandemic. Taken together, this terms of reference would almost certainly make the UK COVID-19 inquiry the largest, the most wide-ranging, the most complex public inquiry ever undertaken. It's also worth noting that the Scottish inquiry has, the Scottish government is going to have a separate inquiry to examine the handling of the pandemic within Scotland. That will also be a statutory inquiry under the Inquiries Act. It will be chaired by Lady Poole, who is a judge on Scotland's Supreme Court. That inquiry is slightly ahead of the UK version. It's already been formally established. I think it has a finalised terms of reference that covers broadly similar ground to the UK inquiry, but is naturally focused on more on devolved matters. The two inquiries are aiming to work very closely together to avoid overlap and unnecessary duplication, but it'll be really interesting to see how they go about doing that. So now thinking about where next. The next slide, please. So we're currently waiting on the Prime Minister's response to Baroness Hallett's recommendations. As Jennifer mentioned, that's sitting in his in tray along with a few other things. When the final terms of reference is agreed and published, then the inquiry will be formally established and it can start work. For the rest of 2022, the most visible aspect of the inquiry's work is likely to be focusing on engaging with people who've been affected by the pandemic. The inquiry has said that it's looking to launch a listening project in the autumn with the aim of understanding how the pandemic has affected different people in a less formal setting than a public hearing. Those formal public hearings are not expected to start until 2023. And there'll be a lot needing to happen behind the scenes to allow that process to start. So the inquiry will need, when it gets its final terms of reference, to work through and analyse the many issues that are covered in there, to identify the really key lines of inquiry the investigation will need to pursue. And it will also need to start gathering what's likely to be a very large volume of evidence and obtaining statements from witnesses to enable it to really examine and pursue those lines of inquiry. That's unlikely to be a quick or an easy process. Given the really broad scope of the inquiry, Baroness Hallett and her team will also need to take some really important decisions about how they structure their investigation. There are a number of different options here. The inquiry could conceivably choose to prioritise some sort of rapid review to identify the main sequence of events and identify any immediate lessons that should be learned for future emergencies before embarking on a full examination. It's worth noting the Health Foundation's Policy Tracker website, which tracked the public policy response to the pandemic during 2020 in excruciating detail and will hopefully give the inquiry a bit of a head start. Alternatively, the investigation could be phased into looking at different periods of time and look at each in turn. So perhaps starting with the situation prior to COVID-19, looking at the initial response to the virus, before then looking at the longer term and wider impacts of the pandemic. Or finally, it could seek to break the matters covered by the terms of reference into a number of discrete modules that could be looked at then in parallel. It's worth noting this is something that the Scottish inquiry appears to be doing. That inquiry has split its terms of reference into 4 portfolios with a designated counsel leading 4 investigative teams working concurrently with the aim of being in a position to report more quickly. And just briefly, those portfolios are looking at the public sector response, so pandemic planning, decisions to lock down, vaccine rollout, financial and welfare support, looking at the provision of health and social care services, and then finally looking at education and the impact on children and young people. And then finally, just to briefly touch on some of the key learning from past inquiries and investigations, which is one of the things that we'll be looking to talk about and draw on today. The point of holding an inquiry is fundamentally to bring about change. But we know from looking at past inquiries that can be really challenging. A statutory inquiry is a really powerful and independent form of investigation, but it doesn't always move especially quickly. That's especially the case when an inquiry is tasked with a very large remit, where there are very high expectations that can prove very difficult to meet. And a broader remit also tends to mean an inquiry takes longer to report. This is important because speed can affect the prospects of an inquiry resulting in positive change. The window for making policy recommendations that are accepted and implemented tends to be quite finite. Government priorities evolve over time. There are changes in the people and organisations who were involved in the pandemic response. We've already seen, for example, Public Health England replaced by the new UK Health Security Agency. And fundamentally, once an inquiry reports, the ball is then in the court of the government, and the decision whether or not to accept recommendations and what to do off of the back of those recommendations rests entirely with ministers. And there's no standing mechanism to follow up on recommendations. If you'd like to read up a bit more on this, the Health Foundation did some work with Manchester and Birmingham universities a few years ago, looking at 50 years of investigations and inquiries within the NHS. And Emma at the Institute for Government also produced an absolutely excellent report on public inquiries, which I'm sure we'll come back to on this. And perhaps we can put links to both of those in the chat as the session goes on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. That was really clear. Can I just ask two very quick follow-up questions? In all the inquiries that you've read about, have any had, in their terms of reference, a time period which is in which they must report? Because this could be quite a kind of gigantic, as you're outlining. So is that a common feature or an uncommon feature to have a sort of time period, 2 years, no more kind of thing?
I don't think I can really comment on how prevalent it is. That might be something that Emma has a bit more expertise to offer on, but it's not unprecedented or unusual. I think, well, certainly not unprecedented to try and set a rough goal for when an inquiry should be aiming to report.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, speed is very, very much of the essence. I think where this can become rather more complex is that inquiries need to go where they need to go.
Yeah.
And setting an arbitrary deadline it can be very challenging to deliver on, while also delivering a really thorough and robust investigation. So it may be that may put more onus on making sure the inquiry has the right structure so that it can start to feed through findings and recommendations at the earliest possible point, rather than holding everything back until there is a comprehensive final report.
Yeah, understood. Sorry, and I'm going to sneak in another very quick one, which is evidence. How far can the inquiry request that evidence that exists is protected and not destroyed as part of these proceedings? I think I read that a letter has been sent by the Baroness to the government's ethics advisor or chief to request that from that date. But is that, yeah, Nuna's nodding, is that correct? Do you know, Tim?
That's right. There has, as you say, there has been a letter from the inquiry to the head of ethics at the Cabinet Office, asking for assurance that records will be kept. Yeah. Listeners may have also seen accounts of how NHS organisations have been asked to retain evidence for use in a future public inquiry. It's probably also worth just spelling out that the powers to seek disclosure of information that are held they're really, really wide-ranging. Right. So they go well over and above what might be expected to be disclosed in response to a freedom of information request. Right. So I think the main exclusions from that are matters covered by legal privilege or public interest immunity, and that sets a really high bar for withholding items for disclosure. I think it's also in the 2005 Act that anyone who interferes with or wrongly withholds information from an inquiry can be prosecuted, because it may well be, I'm not a lawyer, don't take my legal advice, but it may well be an offence to do so. And that disclosure can go well beyond written documentations, beyond emails, and into almost into examining personal devices for WhatsApp messages and other information. So it's really broad power that the inquiry can use if it needs to.
Thank you so much, Tim. Good. I'm now going to turn to Una, who's also very experienced in this kind of thing. And I guess for your general response, Una, but I guess the bottom line question is, does it look so far as if it's on the right track, this inquiry, in terms of the contours you've had laid out? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thanks to Tim for an excellent and very comprehensive introduction. I'll come to your question in a moment, Jennifer, but if I may, I just want to begin with a global public health point, which I hope will really resonate to all of our participants on the call this morning. And it's simply that we are at serious risk globally of another similar different virus. The greater proximity of human settlements to animals has been documented now over a number of years as raising the risk of these zoonotic transmissions. It is a really near and present danger, and we're kidding ourselves if we think, oh well, we've done the pandemic now for this century and that's it. Quite the opposite is the case. So from where I sit, there is a sense of deep anxiety and urgency to get to grips with what worked and what didn't work in this pandemic, so that we can make the changes that need to happen. Now, the first thing to say is that obviously there is a whole raft of institutions and people up and down the country and internationally who are already doing things and making changes following what has happened. So nobody's waiting for the public inquiry as such. However, I do think the inquiry is absolutely essential. I'm very pleased it's going ahead. It's going to be the best mechanism we can have for getting to an incontrovertible account of what happened, particularly because the facts are disputed. And it will enable us to address the question, what could have been done better and what can we learn for the future? So, and if run well and sensitively, it will be a powerful mechanism for settling, if you like, a single version of the truth, for rebuilding trust and therefore providing a platform for change. So normally when we see terms of reference for public inquiry, almost everyone I've ever seen, the comment has been, they're far too narrow, they need to be widened. We are now in a position with the COVID inquiry where we have very wide terms of reference, which are about to be widened even further. And that is going to pose, as Tim has quite rightly alluded to, a whole set of practical challenges about how that can be done. But what I want to just put on the table here today is that whatever the breadth and how that's settled in, right at the core of the inquiry, as its absolute priority in year one, has to be an objective, factual narrative of what happened in 2020 and 2021. And specifically under two headings. First of all, how the pandemic struck. What was the emergent evidence? How did it get translated into models? How was that used or not used by decision makers? How was uncertainty handled? and scientific evidence and data gathered, coordinated and made available to decision makers. So that whole thing about how it struck and how we came to understand its possible impact. But then the second key element of this chronology, from which ought to form, if you like, a core bedrock of all the wider questions, the second one must be how the state in the UK responded. How did the people in key roles respond? How were their efforts coordinated? What was the extent of appropriate collaboration or the lack of it? And operationally, what decisions were taken? Were they timely? And how effectively were they then implemented? And I would like to suggest that in all of the breadth we're talking about in the inquiry, that it will be difficult to really evaluate the evidence on that breadth unless there is, at the very core of it, this account of the emergence of the virus and how key decision makers at local, regional and national level responded. And we need to know this because this is at the core of how we prepare ourselves for the future. So having got that core narrative, I think if for my view would be preparedness has got to be the next key thing. How prepared were we in the light of that, if you like, chronology, public health infrastructure, surveillance systems, infection control, and the government systems for handling emergencies? Because if that's one thing we can focus on and improve, it will put us in a better position to handle serious major public health outbreaks in the future. How is the inquiry doing so far? Well, I think from what Tim has outlined, I discern a number of really significant dilemmas. How to be fast and yet thorough, if, as Tim has said, taking too long risks missing the moment for change. How far back to go? Inquiries can be most useful when they shine a light on systemic failures. But this is an inquiry, it could easily go back, and in some respects should go back 20 years when we look at preparedness and learning from SARS, MERS, and so on. How to be inclusive, which we've got a lot of at the moment, yet stay focused on what really matters. And how not to be a court. This is the public's inquiry, and we're seeing some very interesting developments at the moment. It's early days, but the consultation on the terms of reference is exactly what I've wanted to see if you'd asked me 6 months ago. And the fact that, interestingly, that Baroness Harriott has held back from setting out her alternative form of terms of reference, which she's obviously annexed in her letter to the Prime Minister, which I think is extremely wise, if I might say so, because it has allowed space for continuing dialogue to get that set of terms of reference really settled in the way that she wants them to be. So that's very, very encouraging. I think it's also extremely encouraging the roundtables have been held. And for anyone who's really interested, if you go to the COVID inquiry website, they've actually set out a transcript of each of those 11 roundtables. This is very unusual for a public inquiry to step out into the public domain this early in this way. And I do take a lot of encouragement from that. Plus the fact that Baroness Harriott has said very clearly that the people who suffered most will be at the heart of the inquiry. And you can see her sensitivity to that in the way she's approached the terms of reference. At the same time, it is looking very lawyer heavy at the moment. We have 11 QCs. I have never seen that appointed to inquiry, but even in the last few weeks, 49 junior barristers. This is clearly an inquiry that's either going to become extremely forensic and lawyerly focused, or we're starting to see the capacity put in place to run, similar to what Tim's describes happening in Scotland, a number of different lines of inquiry simultaneously. It will, of course, provide a challenge for coordination within the inquiry itself we've yet to see. So I'm hopeful that we are beginning to see a really strong inquiry. There's a lot more to be done, particularly in terms of how the public will be engaged, which is going to need creativity and innovation on a scale we've never seen. But so far, I'm moderately encouraged by the progress, but not to understate in any sense what it's going to take to resolve those dilemmas.
Thank you so much, Una. Just a couple of questions there. The first one is, given that it's huge scope, what would your advice be on making sure that it just doesn't all land in 10 years' time, that actually there's some useful stuff? What would you be saying to Baroness Hallett about staging some?
Yeah, well, I'm sure she won't need any advice from me. She's so experienced. What a fabulous appointment. You know, I'm just inspired by the fact that she's there and she's doing this. But you know, if you look at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, for example, they have put out that extremely impactful first report, which took an enormous effort to do, to actually describe the fact of what happened. Now, that report in itself has had an impact, but more on actions being taken by government. But it's also helped the inquiry to get on with its work, because now all the different witnesses and participants coming into the next stage of the inquiry know what the inquiry has been able to see across a whole horizon that no one witness could have seen. And so the next stage of the inquiry is stronger for a first report having been put out around the central core events. Right. So it enables the inquiry to make its progress more confidently, I would say. So sequencing of outputs is very, very important. That might not be the only first output, but I would encourage any inquiry to segment and produce outputs along the way.
Right, thank you. And just the other one, I mean, because you've worked in central government for so long, you know, and I'm mindful of going back to Tony Blair's time when it was talked about sofa government. Do you remember there weren't too many minutes taken for key conversations? And also, given the fact there's been quite a bit of time to set this up or to get this far, there's been ample chance for some of the softer intelligence, like texts and all that kind of thing, to be, you know, skillfully removed. And as we saw in some, well, I better not say too much, had I? Otherwise, I'm going to be lawyered out myself. But, you know, in some of the PPE sort of episodes we've seen with one or two cases, how some of the evidence has been deleted. So how far do you think that that the inquiry team can really establish not just what happened, but who was responsible? Or do you think that's a secondary issue next to actually a decision was made to do this, rather regardless of who actually made that decision?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a number of things there in your question. First of all, if we just look at the sources of information and evidence available to an inquiry around a contested topic or a set of events, this is where these barristers completely come into their own, because their approach, and I've very much seen this in action at the inquiry I was on the panel up in Northern Ireland recently, is to work quite forensically across multiple sources of evidence around similar days. So we have both the documents that get brought in from different organisations, have different copies and different versions. The inquiry can press further for metadata held on computers, which is what we did in Northern Ireland, on really key contested events. We were able, using the powers of the inquiry, talking to mobile phone operators with obviously our legitimate legal status, to acquire WhatsApp messages and text messages around some key moments that really had an impact on the evidence. And the other thing is that there are multiple sources of evidence, including the statements that witnesses give. And when they come for oral hearings, council can put to them the statements from other people, documents from organisations that they don't even know exist. So I'm not worried. I don't think myself there's been a mass destruction of documents. I bet there are things that are missing. But we shouldn't underestimate the capability of this investigative team to really try and piece together what happened, where there might be gaps, if you like.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then that raises a separate issue, which I'll leave for the further discussion later, which is lots of public servants under huge stress during the pandemic, now facing a barrage of QCs in what is a very, very tense atmosphere. So what about support for them? Which is a critical thing, isn't it? Otherwise, we'll have a lot of leaders walking off the pitch. But anyway, we'll get back to that later. Thank you very much, Una. So now I turn to Emma. Emma, you're the resident IFG expert on inquiries, and I think your take on this is going to be really interesting. In particular, what you think of things so far, how it's shaping up, and what do you think some of the pitfalls might be that the good Baroness and team need to avoid, amongst other observations. Thanks, Emma.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. I think first, before diving into the questions, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what the government and the inquiry team are getting right so far. I think, as Tim mentioned, the decision to begin with to make this a statutory inquiry under the 2005 Act, and that wasn't necessarily a given. The government could have gone for a non-statutory inquiry. That was, a really important decision that gives the inquiry the powers it needs to compel testimony and to compel the release of documents. I think, as Una and Tim have both said, the appointment of Baroness Hallett, she led the 7/7 inquests, a judge by background who brings that impartiality, that experience with procedures, the experience of marshalling huge quantities of evidence, which we know is going to be, such a core part of this inquiry. So a really strong appointment there. And I think probably most encouraging so far, the approach that's been taken to developing the terms of reference, and not just running a consultation there, but the roadshow approach that the team has taken, including running the roundtables that Una's mentioned. And it's important to remember that a consultation on the terms of reference isn't a requirement. It's a precedent that's been set by inquiries, including Grenfell and the infected blood inquiry, but it's not a requirement. So it's a positive sign that that's the direction that the inquiry team have moved in. So I think all those things should give us hope. So you asked me to think about 3 questions. The first is, what are the kind of central questions that the inquiry should cover? And I think what I'd say here is that for me, as important an issue is how many questions or topics should the inquiry cover. As Tim and Una have both said, this is shaping up to be quite a wide-ranging inquiry, covering a huge number of issues. You could alternatively choose quite a tight inquiry, zooming in on just a few critical topics. And whilst I think wanting a really comprehensive account of what happened is understandable, really broad public inquiries do tend to take much longer to report, and they can risk missing the boat when it comes to effecting change. The Chilcot inquiry was excellent at exposing the shortfalls and flaws in the decision to invade Iraq, but the 7 years it took for the inquiry to report did reduce the impact of its recommendations. So I think it is clear the direction of travel is going to be a broad inquiry for COVID, but that makes it really important that the inquiry is structured in a way that really allows it to have impact. And so I think that leads us neatly onto the second question, which is, what can we learn from previous inquiries? And I think the answer here is that the COVID inquiry can learn lots to a point, but we should also acknowledge that the COVID inquiry is going to, in some ways, be different to other inquiries, and we should acknowledge that and think about the opportunities that brings. So, well, what can be learned? As I said, I think one of the big risks is that this inquiry could be so long that it loses relevance. So I'd be looking at how other inquiries have structured themselves to create really thorough but manageable ways of working. So, for instance, and I often point to this example, the Baham Musa public inquiry, which looked at the death of an Iraqi civilian and the mistreatment of others by British soldiers in Iraq, organised itself into 4 distinct modules, each of which examined a particular theme within the inquiry's terms of reference and did so concurrently. Now, taking that modular approach allows you to look at a wide range of issues, but to look at them together rather than one after the other. So that clearly saves you some time. As Tim wrote in the Health Foundation piece, the 9/11 Commission in the US used a very similar approach. So I think there's something about the way that you structure the inquiry that the COVID inquiry can draw on other inquiries from. I think another area is accessing expertise. This is going to be a massive component of the COVID inquiry. It needs to access scientific expertise, medical expertise, bureaucratic expertise, economic expertise, and more. And again, I think this is somewhere they can draw on other inquiries. I think they're probably going to want to use some kind of expert panel to help set out key concepts, to provide technical advice, and so on. And again, there's lots of precedent to learn from here. Going back to the BSE inquiry, the Butler review, the Iraq inquiry, the recent RHI inquiry that Una's been involved in, they all use panels precisely to provide that kind of deep understanding of subjects that inquiries have to consider. And I think this inquiry should also be using that kind of subject expertise, not just as part of the process of evidence gathering, but also to support the development of recommendations, which again is something we can come back to. But I think it's also, as I've said, important to recognise the ways in which this inquiry is going to be different to others. And I think this is going to be felt most acutely in how the inquiry approaches the task of public engagement. And the sheer scale of the pandemic, which, you know, as we know, has impacted almost every single person in the country, makes the task of engaging with people who have been affected very different to the normal task an inquiry faces. And I think that actually creates an opportunity for innovation, to do something different to usual inquiry processes that the inquiry really needs to grab hold of. I know, and it's really positive, that the team have already started to outline plans for a listening project. And I hope that will look like a mechanism that allows anyone affected by COVID to share their experience, similar to, say, the Truth Project that was used as part of the inquiry into childhood sexual abuse. And then some of that evidence can then be kind of used in the formal inquiry if needed. But the critical thing there is that it's a way of giving as many people as possible voice during the inquiry. I think the other option, which as far as I know hasn't been used in the UK inquiry so far, but I do think is worthy of consideration, is using some form of deliberative process within the inquiry. So for instance, considering taking the draft findings and having them considered by a citizens panel or a citizens assembly, similar to the kind of mechanisms that have been used by Parliament recently on climate change. Finding some way to bring in kind of citizens to the heart of the inquiry, I think, is really important. Whatever the inquiry decides on public engagement, I think ensuring the experiences of everyday citizens are given voice and put at the heart of the inquiry is really important. I'm not somebody who argues that the core of an inquiry is catharsis. I think the core of an inquiry is learning and change, but I think this is one of the priorities for this inquiry. And then the last question that you asked me was, how can the inquiry be most impactful? And for me, this is really the most important question for any inquiry. And I think one of the areas that public inquiries sometimes struggle with. And I think there are two ways of ensuring an inquiry leads to change. The first is setting up an inquiry with impact in mind. And I'd highlight two things here. First, use interim reports. Don't sit on urgent findings for years, publish them quickly and make change happen whilst that opportunity is there. And so really pleased to see interim reports mentioned in the draft terms of reference. And I think you also need to invest in the process of developing recommendations. So use subject experts to test your ideas as they're emerging and to make those recommendations as strong as possible. This is an area that Una will be able to talk lots about in the Kennedy inquiry. They use seminars with experts, including doctors and other medical practitioners, to help develop those recommendations. And I know Una talks really eloquently about that process. I think then the second part for ensuring that the inquiry can have impact is accountability. And I think the absence of any serious formal processes for holding ministers to account for implementing inquiry recommendations is actually a really troubling part of what is missing in public inquiries more broadly, not just on the COVID inquiry. Once an inquiry reports, the inquiry is disbanded, and judicial chairs often consider their roles complete for completely understandable reasons, although I understand that Baroness Hallett potentially takes a different view. But at that point onwards, once the inquiry has been disbanded, there is no formal or prescribed route for holding government to account and ensuring that it's taking action. Now, sometimes chairs take matters into their own account, into their own hands. Michael Bichard, who chaired the Soham inquiry, reconvened his inquiry 6 months after it reported, informally to assess what government had done. That might be one of the things that Baroness Hallett could consider doing. The Francis inquiry into mid-staffs built a really strong relationship with the Health Select Committee, which then ran regular deep dives to assess the state of implementation. And I definitely think the COVID inquiry should be identifying which select committees are going to be key and building those relationships with them throughout the inquiry process. And then the kind of emerging model, and again, I'll point to Una here as somebody who's going to talk most eloquently about this, is looking for an alternative body to hold government to account. In the case of the RHA inquiry, they worked with the Northern Ireland Audit Office, who is going to report on the state of the inquiry's implementation with regular public reporting. And I think that there's a real, there's something really interesting there, looking at the possibility of organisations like the NAO in the UK or another independent body actually holding government to account for the state of implementation when the inquiry reports. So those are just some of the things I think we could do to make the inquiry as effective as possible. I think the key thing I just want to emphasise is that the complexity of this inquiry, the scale of what it has to consider, and the number of people with a close interest in it means that the team running the inquiry have the chance to do something new, to take an innovative approach to public engagement, to use expertise in a really kind of exciting, structured way, and to forge a new approach to accountability. And I think getting those things right is just as important as the content of the inquiry. Thanks.
Fantastic, Emma. Thank you so much. Just a couple of questions on that as well. That clear account. I mean, if you think about it going forwards, there's the inquiry. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on around which will be looking at what happened. We've had 2 parliamentary committees join forces, haven't we, to already start looking at this. That's the Health Committee and the Science and Technology Committee. We've got the NAO, as you mentioned. They've also begun. You also have, in a different sort of slipstream, you have some court cases as well that will be delivering evidence. And you may even have some international sort of groups looking at Britain compared to other countries. How does all of that, in a sense, the inquiry has to draw on all of that, doesn't it? But also, how does it not get unduly influenced by those things? And even possibly, I don't know whether it could be conflicted by some of those things as well. How do you see, do you see any, how should it respond to these other things? And is there's no guiding hand at the moment, it strikes me, in this ecosystem of inquiry. The biggest nucleus will be the inquiry.
Indeed. And I think, what you're highlighting just speaks to how complex this inquiry is, because it has touched on so many different areas of kind of public life and governance. It's inevitable that you're going to see different forms of lesson learning kind of popping up all over the system, as you say, in the kind of parliamentary space. Departments will also be running lesson learning. We know that departments are running lesson learning exercises too,
Yeah.
other public bodies. You're going to probably see some kind of citizen-led groups running their own kind of people's panels. So there's going to be lots of different information kind of emerging. I think on balance, that's something that we should embrace. As I've said, I think the kind of priority is learning lessons and making sure that they're implemented in a kind of timely manner. And if there are other processes going on alongside the inquiry that enable government to learn lessons quickly and to try and implement those, I think that can only be a good thing. I think the inquiry needs to make sure that it is able to kind of take in as much of that evidence as it needs to. And actually, that's quite a big opportunity for the inquiry, that there are other processes running that it can draw upon rather than operating in a vacuum. I think the key is how it makes use of that evidence in a timely way. And that's why I think either going for a kind of rapid review model where you say, actually, first, the inquiry is going to focus on the urgent lessons that need to change now, in case there is, a kind of variant of concern that means government needs to respond rapidly again to COVID, or there is, God forbid, another pandemic in, 5 or 6 years' time and it needs to respond quickly. Making sure that it can do that learning quickly and give advice to government quickly on the things that need to change now, I think is the kind of the core task for the inquiry before it then moves into the kind of longer run of its work. But I think, my main point is we should welcome rapid lesson learning, and the inquiry should see all the different activity that is going on in public life at the moment as an opportunity rather than a kind of challenge.
Yeah. And just before I turn to all of you with one other question, the inquiry, I don't remember seeing the word international in but tell me if I'm wrong. So there will be ways that we how we responded to external information coming from the international global health systems and how we interacted with those. Is that your understanding is part of this inquiry? And are there any other international inquiries that are looking? I mean, I know WHO has looked at various bits of this, various questions, not completely the broad range as in this inquiry. So how do you think the international focus will be part of the inquiry, or is it really a UK wide mainly?
So the inquiry is very explicitly UK wide rather than international, but I think that I would expect some questions to look at whether we responded kind of quickly enough to information coming in from elsewhere. And I think that there are a range of international inquiries, or rather inquiries going on in other countries at the moment, that the inquiry in the UK will be able to draw on. I mean, actually, Tim, you produced a great table in the Health Foundation's report, didn't you, looking at all the different national inquiries and reviews that are currently going on in Europe and North America, and you know, there are kind of tens and tens of them going on at the moment. So I would expect that information to be feeding into the UK inquiry, but I think the question they'll be looking at is, what does that mean for the UK, not what do we want to say about the international picture. This inquiry is focused on what happened in the UK and the extent to which government and others' response was adequate.
Thank you very much. And then maybe a question to all of you, because you've all referred to this very important issue about the recommendations, you know, the number, the staging of, the type of recommendations that land most effectively. Given all your experience, I wondered whether you could give us some more detail on that. I mean, clearly the timeliness of recommendations is important, but tell us a little bit more about the number, how specific, what really works in the inquiries that you're most familiar with. Perhaps I'll turn to Tim first, because you actually helped with the government response, didn't you, to the mid-staffs inquiry and voluminous recommendations.
Indeed, and I still have very vivid memories of receiving that report the day before it was published, and almost immediately flipping to the back to look at how many recommendations there were. Yep. It's a really interesting question. I think there is. I would say it's not so much about the sheer quantity of recommendations, but more the manner in which they're developed and the manner in which they emerge. So holding back, for this inquiry in particular, the notion of holding back all recommendations until a final report is not going to be a good option, given the sheer breadth of topics that the inquiry will be looking at. So being able to start that process sooner rather than later, whether that's through an interim report or a series of more focused reports with a smaller and more discrete number of recommendations, would be a good thing to do. As Una and Emma have both pointed out, the policy process should be more than an afterthought. It needs to. The inquiry would be well advised, I think, to start thinking about how it is going to develop recommendations. How can it involve experts, others with a lived experience? How can it start involving those people in order to shape recommendations to make sure that they are as robust and as right as they can be? Going from identifying and really understanding a problem, it takes a lot of work, but understanding the right solutions also takes a lot of work and shouldn't be overlooked. One other thought that occurs is how can the inquiry square its independence with potentially thinking about how it can inform and engage with policymakers as it proceeds. Now, I don't have any brilliant ideas or solutions as to how it might do this, but being able to bring out some of the emerging themes from its investigation, rather than keeping those completely internal to the inquiry, engaging policymakers in some of those themes, some of the issues that are emerging, might be worth considering. My experience with mid-staffs, Una's may be similar or may not be, is that it proceeded very much in parallel with the development of the coalition government's NHS reforms. And the two processes didn't really cross over an enormous amount. The inquiry was one heck of an enterprise and demanded almost total focus. Reforming the health service was equally demanding of focus. So there was minimal time on each side to actually look and try and understand some of those emerging themes and how they might need to feed into policy right now. So that might be something that is worth exploring, but how that can be squared with maintaining the inquiry's independence and perceptions of independence is possibly a slightly thornier issue.
Thank you. Una, can I just turn to you about your thoughts about recommendations, if you're advising Baroness Hallett and the team right now as to how to think about that at this stage?
Well, Jennifer, in addressing this question, I can't avoid taking a 20-25-year perspective. It's just over 20 years since we published the Bristol Inquiry report, and I'll come to mid-staffs in a moment. And of course, I've only very recently been involved in helping to shape the recommendations with the Judge Coughlin on the report in Northern Ireland. My overall view from those experiences is that in public inquiries, on the inside, we worry too much about the recommendations docking into the here and now of policy. And I would encourage these days any public inquiry to take the bigger stage that it's been given to say the things that aren't being said, that aren't being properly addressed by the policy community in central government or parliament or amongst political parties, and to worry less about providing lots of detailed design type recommendations. Just the other day, I went back, Bristol Inquiry, 198 recommendations. Actually, there were 10 really important things from that inquiry that needed to change. But looking back on the list of recommendations, we didn't even make that as clear as we should have done. That followed through, for example, in the press announcement. Whereas as a record in the inquiry, you'd never know now, looking back, which were the 10 things that should have been prioritised.
Yeah.
It's equally the case with mid-staffs. I mean, we've got nearly 400 recommendations there. And I think too much of an effort to try and dock in or to over-design, a lot of them already look very out of date. So that's not to, in any sense, take away from the immense intention of that inquiry to make a difference. But the really big and important things that the inquiry was speaking about still need to be attended to. And there's a risk that they'll be lost in this, mountain of recommendations. So I think bigger, fewer, quicker is my answer on recommendations.
Thank you. And Emma, is that something you'd agree with?
I completely agree with Una that I think even if you do end up with kind of 200 recommendations, being able to walk away with a clear sense of what the absolute priorities for kind of bigger picture change are should be at the heart of the recommendations. I think the only other thing I would add actually around Tim's point on expertise is that in addition to kind of building recommendations, drawing on kind of key subject expertise, I think another area of the inquiry, any inquiry needs to ensure it has covered is that kind of Whitehall and bureaucratic expertise. When you're building your recommendations, really being able to draw on people who have, developed this kind of thing in government before, who know how to kind of structure a recommendation that's likely to land, who have some sense of the kind of implementation landscape. I think that's a really important part of making sure that your recommendations are likely to kind of get traction and lead to the changes that you want to see.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we've had a lot of questions. Thank you so much. And I'm very pleased to say that quite a few of them we've already answered in our discussion to date, but let's just draw on a few. So there's a really interesting one, given Tim's point about independence, that if you're really bringing in a lot of expertise to help you, a lot of those experts will be implicated. Anyway, well, not implicated, they will have had a role, won't they? So how do you maintain this independence when really a lot of the key experts were active actors in this in this story of the pandemic?
Yeah. Can I have a go at that, Jennifer?
Yeah.
I mean, there are numerous ways that that can be addressed. We face this exact dilemma on the Bristol inquiry because paediatric cardiac surgery is a very small specialty.
Yeah.
And pretty much everybody knew everybody amongst that community. So what we did then, which was quite innovative for a public inquiry, first of all, at the time, it was common for different legal representatives to have their own experts. And Ian Kennedy was determined that he wasn't going to have experts giving evidence against each other. And he came up with this idea, which worked absolutely brilliantly, that we would have a panel of experts. I think there were about 20 or 25, primarily on cardiac surgery, children's care, and also on medical statistics. And the parties to the inquiry could draw on that expertise, could commission a paper, but the paper would have to be published and made available to all the legal participants and to the public. And all the expert evidence was, and the papers that were commissioned were made public. Right. So that's a way of using, if you like, the limited expertise that exists, but making it available. This is going to be a real challenge on this inquiry. And some people say, let's go and get international experts, but they're all tied up in their own inquiries and their own roles. So it's going to take a bit of creative thinking to draw on the very best brains in the country, but to do so in a way that doesn't feel like it's party pre, but for the public and for the inquiry.
Yeah. Anybody else want to crack at that one? No takers. That's great. Thank you. There is a number of questions which are mostly about what happened and the speed of government response. Could have been faster, I think is a lot of theme in there. And I just wonder whether there's establishing the facts, how fast were decisions made, but in terms of understanding what was behind that, I mean, how far, I mean, let me just try and phrase this slightly differently. I mean, there are some people who are very risk averse and take decisions quickly to mitigate risk. And there are some people who actually don't see downside risk in decisions. They see upside opportunities and they wait until the last possible minute to make decisions. So it's almost a kind of cognitive bias in decision making. It's sort of almost a constitutional thing, maybe even a psychological thing. To what extent, given that speed is such a central question, government was too slow, apart from establishing whether it was slow or not, to what extent do you think the inquiry should get under the root of that in trying to mitigate problems in the future? In other words, so if a lot of government decision making is insufficiently cautious, or the other way round, that is a problem, isn't it? Am I explaining this properly? So to what extent do you think the inquiry will be getting at that kind of, in a sense, cognitive bias towards A, risk taking, or B, risk mitigation?
Well, I'll start because I can see Emma's making a few comments and I'm sure she'll come in on this. Well, look, this is an extremely important and live issue, both in relation to February and March 2020, but also links into some other questions to do with the run up to the 2021 lockdown. So the point about the inquiry here, where the inquiry's first work gets done, is not so much to look at those decisions from the point of view of how things turned out. Because at the moment, everyone's got views about those timeframes because we know how things turned out and how badly things turned out for tens of thousands of people and so on. But what the purpose of the aim of the inquiry will be to try and uncover that chronology from the point of view of the people who were there at the time and the contemporaneous documents. that will allow us some insights into, because there's a whole load of stuff that we don't know, or that no one has got the whole picture about how those discussions worked and who was relating to whom and all of that. If it should turn out, that what you've described, Jennifer, is a key issue, and intuition suggests that it might be, of course, that in order to help understand how decision making gets done in a major crisis in the future, that would be, I should have thought, a very important secondary element. But I don't think you can really go there until you try and uncover, go back and walk through those days and weeks as they appeared to people at the time who engaged with them, and they've been a chance to give their evidence as they saw things at the time.
Yeah, Emma, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that kind of cognitive bias, either towards or against risk taking, will inevitably be kind of part of the picture. But I think as important a question that plays into that speed issue is how prepared was government for some of the key questions that it would have to have answers to. And I think that's why ensuring that the inquiry has a focus on our state of preparedness is so crucial. We know, for instance, that we had not done a lot of preparation around what a strong economic response to a pandemic of this sort would look like. We similarly know that despite the potential need for school closures coming up in various planning exercises, we did not have plans in place for how to manage and implement mass school closures as a result of a pandemic. And not having that preparation in place will inevitably have an impact on the speed with which decision makers are able to act when they are then in that situation. And so I think understanding the state of our preparedness is kind of crucial for then providing access to the speed question.
Thank you very much. Now we're running out of time, but there have been quite a few questions, which I think you've responded to in part on inequalities. And I mean, I think you've all said that inequalities is clearly a central part of this, not just the catharsis to help understand the extent of inequality and that resulted from decisions made, but also what to do about it. And I don't know whether you had any further comments on, apart from hearing the testimony and looking at the facts in terms of how different groups were affected, in terms of what you think could be in the recommendations when it comes to what to do in future. Is this mostly about the public health response, do you think, and the economic response to make sure that certain vulnerable groups are focused on more than they were? Is that the central question? Una, did you?
It's probably the deepest and most fundamental question that this inquiry has to face. I think rather like a war, a major public health emergency holds up a mirror to the society that we have. And it doesn't matter which topic you take, inequalities is going to be part of this. And I hope that in the design, inequalities is not put off as its separate subject. Because whether you look at communication, you look at the experience of school-aged children, if you look at the experience of people living in more deprived areas of the country, that is not the same as people, I heard this terrible phrase, I had a good lockdown. There's been such a difference of experience, and it's extremely important that the inquiry can reveal the scale of that. And in terms of recommendations, I think it's going to be quite difficult because the inquiry can't turn itself into the government.
No.
The testimony in itself will be an incredible powerhouse for change.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, we have to leave it there. That was a really, really thoughtful discussion. I'm very grateful to all our speakers, Tim Gardner, Una O'Brien and Emma Norris. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your questions, and I hope we covered the bulk of them, at least the main themes. This story is going to run and run. We'll do surely more on this, as will Emma and at IFG, and I hope that Una as well can join us as we go through this inquiry and see how it pans out to make sure that it lands as as well as it can. Thank you so much. You can sign up to more updates on our webinars, have a look at the link in the chat and on the screen. And thank you very much for joining us, and hope you join us in future for our future seminars. Thank you very much.